And now let's start a day with our very first speaker, Lili, who is a co-developer of Sociocracy 3. She serves internationally, providing learning facilitation and mentoring to groups and organizations, wishing to develop greater effectiveness and collaboration. Lili, please take the stage.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you today and to share about something called Sociocracy 3.0. If I would be to summarize in one word what I think is one of the greatest challenges we're facing in organizations today, that would be complexity. Yes, it's working. Well, basically, we're faced with a rapidly changing environment where, there's a fast pace of change, a lot of uncertainty, and unpredictability. The slides are going a little bit slower than I'm expecting. So, in such an environment, it's much more difficult to plan and try to control things. So we are really reliant on each other to kind of see the whole picture and navigate. So the question is, how does leadership and how does management look in such an environment? And one question that has been guiding me throughout my work with organizations the last years is how we can, this is not working properly. So, how can we make the best use of our time, resources, and energy to create value together? And I studied business management, and I remember as a young and rather idealistic person during my studies, I thought, that's not how I want to do things. It seemed like the essence of what I was taught was that people need to be told what to do, somebody needs to organize others, and even motivate them. And I saw the world quite differently back then, so I started working in social sector, grassroots initiatives where I was working with highly motivated people that were really doing their best to bring a positive contribution to the world. And after a while, I had to be Yes. Okay, I'm going to have a new clicker. So, let's see if that works. Yes, perfect. So, after a while, I had to admit to myself that despite this amazing energy and potential, we were quite ineffective. We were sort of caught up in really lengthy meetings. Nobody wanted to be the boss because we wanted to do things equally. And there were a lot of challenges that came through that particular approach to doing things. And I thought, wait a minute, maybe something about what I've learned in my studies wasn't such a bad idea. And I started questioning, how are we going to do this? How are we going to create value together in an effective way? And this is what brought me to Sociocracy, and then later on I got involved in developing Sociocracy 3.0. And for me, the reason why I feel most passionate about this is because it brings together these two worlds, these two apparently irreconcilable aspects of organization. So on one hand, it brings the respect for the individual, a space for them to express themselves, to bring their own creativity, tap into their own motivation, and also for the collective, because there is a huge distributed intelligence amongst the people, and I saw that, and I saw moments when that was happening, but it seemed to be quite random, and I really wanted to figure out how to achieve that. On the other hand, it also brings the structures, the rules, the processes, the clarity, the things that we need to actually get stuff done and achieve the goals we wanted to achieve. So if I would be to summarize that in 2 words, we're talking about organizations that are engaging and effective. So today, I want to talk about, first of all, what is this thing called sociocracy, and then what Sociocracy 3.0 is. I'm going to call it S3 for short. And then I want to share with you some of the insights that I've gained through the last 7 years of working and applying these things in organizations and teaching others as well. I'm really hoping to give you some practical things, small things that you can do and hopefully apply in the context of your organization and get, well, good results or better results. So, let's get going. First of all, can you raise your hand if you heard of the term sociocracy before this conference? Okay, unfortunately, there's nobody upstairs, so it's just here. Okay, so not so many people, great. So basically, sociocracy is a form of governance. By the way, this screen here doesn't work, so I don't actually see what's on. That's why I'm looking backwards. Maybe the tech team can solve that. So it's basically a form of governance developed by Auguste Comte in 1851, so it's quite a long time ago. And it's basically, he had this idea that we need a more scientific, evidence-based approach to the governance of nations if we are to address the needs of the wider population and not just the ruling class. Kind of a nice idea, right? This concept has evolved a lot throughout time, and many different people have influenced it. But essentially what it means is rule by the social group. So we have socius, which refers to associates, companion social group, and kratos, power. So if you think democracy, rule by the demos, by the wider population, sociocracy is bringing power to influence to a smaller entity, the social group. And it's really about distributing power to influence close to where value is created. And in that process, supporting to harness the intelligence that is distributed among the people, and it invites empiricism and continuous improvement. So in a nutshell, that is what sociocracy is. But many people, when they're using this word, they're actually referring to something called the Sociocratic Circle method, which is a methodology that was developed in the 1960s by somebody called Gerard Endenberg from the Netherlands. And it was basically a system he created to, that handled governance of an organization in a sociocratic way. And in the last years, we've seen a few spin-offs of this methodology, particularly since some of the literature has been translated to English, and also new literature came out about this. And one of these spin-offs is holacracy. Can you raise your hand if you heard of holacracy? Okay, so yes, more people. So Frederick Laloux, in his book Reinventing Organization, did this massive service because it mentioned about holacracy, and it brought also then sociocracy more into the consciousness of the people. And back in 2014, my colleagues, James, who's here today, also my husband, we were not married though before that, at that time, and my other colleague, Bernard Bockelbrink from Berlin, got together to basically put together some resources about this methodology for the Agile and Lean audience. And after a few iterations, they realized something else was emerging that was quite different, and they decided to call that Sociocracy 3.0. And I joined the collaboration a few months later, and ever since we're basically working together to develop resources and make them available to organizations today. So, what is Sociocracy 3.0? Basically, first of all, what is not a methodology or a framework. It's also not addressing only the topic of governance, but also other aspects like operations, building and structuring organizations, and other aspects of organizational development and management. It's highly influenced by Agile and Lean thinking, and it's free to use. We are developing these resources. If you go to our website, you're going to be able to read the whole guide that explains what this is. So, if it's not a methodology or a framework, what is it then? Well, it's basically a collection of tried and tested patterns from various methodologies, sociocratic and Agile and Lean methodologies, that you can choose from when your current approach fails to bring about the results you expect or wish to see. So, what does that really mean? Basically, we wanted to acknowledge the fact that every context is unique. Every organization is different, and what works for one organization doesn't work for another. And the challenge we're having when we're implementing a methodology is that we're changing from a current way of doing things to a completely new way, which means on that journey, we are losing some of the value of the old way of doing things. So we want to basically encourage people to acknowledge what works and build on that, identify and respond to needs they have in their own context. And really, if it's not broken, don't fix it. We're busy already doing so many things. And we want to approach change in an iterative way, in a complexity-friendly way, where we're meeting people where they are and supporting them to move forward at their own pace, one step at a time, and really support them to build their own tailor-made framework made up of all these patterns from S3 and maybe others as well in the world today. So, I mentioned the word patterns a few times. You might ask yourself what we mean by that. Well, they're basically practices, processes, or guidelines that are helping us to navigate successfully a specific context. And in S3, we have 74 of them. And they are grouped in categories. So we have patterns for sense-making and decision-making, for organizing work, building, structuring organizations, peer development, and so on. And behind these principles, these patterns are the 7 principles. They are, if you like, the silver thread that weaves together all of these patterns. And they're referring to how we behave, how we interact. And I believe they're essential to understand because you will get an idea of the kind of behavior these patterns are encouraging in organizations. So I want to just briefly run through them. The first one is equivalence, which is very much connected to the idea of sociocracy, involving people in decisions that affect them. Now, this is not the same as equality, which means that we are all the same, because let's be honest, we are not the same, we are different, and it's precisely for that reason that we need equivalence. We need those different perspectives. And also I want to clarify, equivalence doesn't mean that we involve people in all decisions all of the time. That doesn't scale well. It's not a good idea. So it's an invitation for us to think about when to involve people, where, and to which degree. We might bring everybody together in the same space for a decision. We might consult people, or we might just simply be open to consider somebody's perspective when they come to us and say, hey, I see a problem with what you're doing, or I see a way of doing this better. And this ties into the second principle, which is consent, which means raising, seeking out, and resolving objections to decisions and actions. And so this is not consensus, which is consensus with unanimity refers to this idea of we're all in agreement and we're focused on reaching agreement. Consent basically refers to the absence of objections. So that relies on us understanding what an objection is. And we define that as arguments that people bring in relation to decisions and actions that reveal consequences or risks that we'd rather avoid, or demonstrate worthwhile ways to improve things. Now, just let's pause for a moment. That might maybe sound kind of common sense, and I think it is, because if you think about it, if somebody comes to you and says, look, I think if we're heading in this direction, we're going to fall off the cliff, and here's the reason why, you'd want to listen, right? And the same, if somebody comes to you and say, hey, I see a way we can do this even better, and I can explain why it's worth our while to do so, then again, you want to listen as well. So consent is about being reasonable. It's about being open to consider different perspectives and to harness disagreement and dissent in a constructive way. So, if you want equivalence and consent, you're also going to need transparency. It supports both these two other principles. So transparency is about recording information that is valuable and making it accessible to others, unless, of course, there is a reason for confidentiality. So if people know what is happening in the organization, then they're more able to contribute, they're more able to understand the bigger picture and how what they do contributes to the whole. And if you have these three principles in place, a natural consequence of that is that there is going to be also more accountability. People will respond when something is needed. They're going to do what they agree to do, at least to their best ability, and they're going to accept their share of responsibility for the whole course of the organization, and take care of the integrity and the well-being of that as well. And the next principle is effectiveness. This is crucial, right? We need to devote our time only to what brings us closer to achieving the organization's overall objective. Anything else is waste, and the question is, how can we eliminate that? Obviously, it implies we need to be clear on what these objectives are, right? So, last two principles, empiricism, which comes very close to Comte's original idea of bringing in more the scientific approach to doing things. So it's about testing all assumptions that we rely on through experiments and continuous revision. And also then to stop and regularly review the outcomes that we're getting and make incremental improvements to what we do and how we do it based on what we learn. So these are the 7 principles. I'm going to drink some water. Let that sink in for a moment. So, that was basically covering what Sociocracy is and what Sociocracy 3.0 is. So for the next part of the talk, I want to focus on some of these practical insights that I've gained through applying some of these patterns and principles in organizations, and also from connecting with the community of people that are currently using S3. And one question I get a lot is, who is using S3? Everybody wants to know. They want some kind of famous case study they can look to, and this makes a lot of sense. The challenge is that besides the fact that there are all these free resources, and there are a lot of people who simply just read from the guide and start applying and using things from there, there is also, because of this approach to implementation, which is not really an implementation, pulling in patterns in response to need, it's not like there are organizations that use all of these patterns all of the time, right? But there are people who are using, there is a recurrent, an emerging pattern. I see these, some of these patterns that are used again and again in organizations. What I can say about who is using S3 is that James and I have been teaching a few thousand people the last few years, and about 60% of the people who are joining our public courses are coaches and consultants. And they've basically been adding to their already existing toolkit these learnings and have been applying them with their clients, often even without mentioning S3, which is also something that we encourage, because it's not really about doing S3. It's about solving the problems and taking advantage of the opportunities that you have in your organizations. And if S3 patterns can help with that, then that's great. So, these key patterns that I'm going to talk about are addressing some key challenges. One is clarifying the why, how we can distribute responsibilities and power to influence in an effective way, and how we can make decisions effectively. So, clarifying the why. I mean, we already heard yesterday reference of like famous speakers that are saying, oh, this is really important, and I would agree with that. The thing is that it's not so easy to do. So I'm interested in how we're going to do that. And basically, in all the organizations that I've worked with, there has been inevitably, I've seen situations where there is some kind of policy that exists and everybody's doing it, but nobody knows why it's there. Or some structure in place that doesn't make sense to some people and the why is unclear, or they have different ideas about it. I've been in situations myself and seen many others where people come together to make a decision thinking, oh yeah, it's clear why we're making this decision, only to discover later on that there were different assumptions about that. And not to mention meetings that take place without a clear why, and people asked to do stuff without understanding why and how that fits with the bigger picture. So there is this story, real story about a bank in Sweden that basically had an attic full of newspapers. And they discovered this doing a routine check by a safety fire officer. And it turns out that in there they had every daily newspaper that was published in Sweden over the last 50 years. And this came to a surprise to most people in the organization. They had no idea about this. And basically, it turns out that there was this director that one day, back in the 1960s, he was really angry because he couldn't find the daily newspaper. So he ordered, or like asked, let's say, one of the assistants that they should buy the every daily newspaper and store it in the attic so that never happens again. So that person left about 10 years later, and still this task has been passed on from one assistant to another for 50 bloody years. And I think this is such a great example of the kind of waste we can have in organization if there is no clarity on why, if we don't stop to question, hey, wait a minute, but why are we doing this? So, in S3, back to S3, there is a concept called driver, which is basically the term we use to define a person or a group's motive for responding to a situation. And we are basically using this concept to describe, to clarify the why for the whole organization, for every team, every role, decisions, and so on. And there's a specific way of doing that, of clarifying the why or describing it. And basically it needs to include 4 elements. The first one is a brief description of the current situation in an observable way. Then you need to explain the effect or the anticipated effect that that situation has on the organization. And particularly if you're responsible for that driver, you also need to clarify what is needed or what is deficit or necessary in that situation and the anticipated impact of responding to that need. So this might seem like a lot, but actually you can do that in quite a brief way, and I'm gonna demonstrate this. This is the driver for this talk, or at least how I understood it, based on an email exchange with the organizers of this conference, because I asked, why am I here? So, if we break this down, the current situation is that in recent years, many people have been using S3 patterns, and the effect of that is that it helped them to respond more effectively to the challenges and opportunities they're facing, or at least as far as we can tell. And the need is, again, determined by the organizers, because it was their driver. They thought, well, we do want to introduce S3 to our audience, to all of you folks, to raise understanding of it and how it can be of help to them. So, not more than 2 sentences can summarize the driver. And this is useful because it really helps us to make sense of things and attribute meaning. Hey, I see this is happening and this might be needed. What do you think? How should we interpret this situation? And it also helps to build a shared understanding of what we do and how we do things. There's this saying, a problem understood is a problem half solved. And it's also a way of communicating with others. Hey, I think this driver might be in your area of responsibility. What do you think? And to remember why and to monitor change. So that was it about clarifying the why. I do encourage to try it out. It might be weird in the beginning to think in the frame of these 4 elements, but once you do it, I can guarantee it's gonna kind of get into your blood. I had this conversation recently with a bunch of people from a bank in Belgium that are using S3 patterns, so I was checking in with them and asking, okay, so what are you using? Part of my mini research. And so they listed a few things, and I said, well, how about drivers? And they were like, right, this is from S3, I forgot. And I think they were saying, well, we're just basically using it all the time, and to the extent that I even forgot that was part of it. And I think that is the kind of thing I see happening in the world. You might not use the term driver, it really doesn't matter. It's about clarifying why you're doing things. So, next point, distributing responsibilities and power to influence in an effective way. How we're gonna do that? I mean, hopefully I don't need to say too much about why we should do that. In a complex environment, it's necessary to, at least to a certain degree, to distribute responsibilities, power to influence throughout the system. If I would be to sum up in one phrase how that looks like, is that we want to free people up to create value as autonomously as possible so that we can deliver value fast and avoid unnecessary dependencies. So this might sound good, or at least interesting. The question is how we're going to do that. And basically, in S3, we make a point that if you want to free people up, with freedom comes responsibility. And those responsibilities need to be clear. we heard yesterday the importance of clarity in general, right? So we're basically making a point about clarifying areas of activity, influence, and decision-making, and we call these things domains. And you can look at any organization through as a constellation of domains, starting with the overall domain of the organization, and then subdomains within it. And domains are delegated to people who take responsibility for them. And in this process, there is a template we're using, or a canvas, that helps to clarify that domain. So these are the elements we identified as beneficial to consider if you want to clarify domain. The question is, when we're delegating responsibility for domains to others, is what are the minimum necessary constraints that will enable people to account for this domain and create value as effectively as possible. So you don't want to over-constrain people so that they don't have the freedom to create value, but also you don't want to make the constraints too fuzzy or vague or even non-existing, because also then in that situation people will potentially become reluctant to take action because they're unclear, or they're going to take action and cross certain boundaries that they were not aware of. And I think we've heard this mentioned yesterday as well. So the pattern is called Clarify and Develop Domains, and it's really about making explicit this implicit, often implicit, agreement between delegator, the one who's delegating influence, and delegatee, the one who's accepting responsibility for domains. And you can do that in the moment when you're delegating, but also retrospectively. So you might want to bring more clarity to responsibilities in the organization. Then if you would do that, you would start with the delegatees, filling out this canvas, and then checking with the delegator, hey, is this what you thought about what we're doing, and evolve it from there. And the evolving bit is really important because this is not a static document. We need to develop how we design the domains and how we distributed the resources and power to influence in an iterative and incremental way based on the outcomes we get and the learning throughout time. So there is a section, monitoring and evaluation, which basically refers to, well, that's where you would put information about when you would evaluate, how, who needs to be involved, and so on. So we're not only delegating operations, this is what we typically do. We're delegating tasks that need doing and things regarding organizing the day-to-day activities. We also need to delegate governance as well if we want to enable autonomy and allow people to create value. And governance is, the way we define it, is about setting objectives and making and evolving decisions that guide people towards achieving those objectives. And there is governance of the whole organization, but also each domain there usually has some topics regarding governance that are typically in a more traditional organization handled by managers. And what Sociocracy says is that governance needs to include more people rather than just the manager. So if we are going to do that and include more people, different line of thought. So one other thing about this idea of freeing individuals up is that it's based on the assumption that there's these dependencies that can be avoided. So we should make that clear. But sometimes dependencies cannot be avoided. So we need to collaborate to co-create and evolve a system to deal with them. And this is where organizational structure comes in, which is the actual arrangements of domains and the connections between them. And it's not about boxes and lines. It's really something that reflects how responsibilities are distributed, where power to influence is located, and the channels through which that information and influence flows. And it's not, again, something static, something that is constantly evolving. And in S3, we have a few patterns that are offering different options on how to handle those dependencies that could be of inspiration or of use to you, should you choose to look into it. Of course, I'm not going to go into it right now, because the last topic I want to cover is making decisions effectively. So I said about distributing not only work, but governance as well. So if you are going to enable people to make governance decisions, then you also want to make sure they're able to do that effectively. And I want to introduce you to the idea of agile governance. So we've invested billions in developing agile operations, and I think we can do a good job in terms of that. But a key missing element is the governance side, or the decision-making side. And we can apply the same principles to decision-making as well. So agile decision-making is about designing safe-to-fail experiments in response to needs so that we can learn fast and develop as we go. And you might do that. Obviously, that would require at least some of the time to bring people together to design those experiments. But the question is when and why would you do that? Because obviously, it's going to take more time, and you want to make sure that the benefits outweigh the costs. So it's usually useful to include people when you are responding to a new or complicated or complex situation when you want to harness experience, diversity, and incent, and you want to increase ownership over decisions. And there are some S3 patterns that can help with that. These are also some of the most commonly used ones in organizations today. So I'm going to do one of those things, say 4 ingredients for effective decision-making. This is not an exclusive list. Probably there are many other ingredients that are necessary, but these are just 4 I want to mention. So first of all, you need to be clear on why you're making that decision. You need some kind of idea or proposal to how to respond to that problem or opportunity, and you would do that either in a group or an individual does it. And you need some way of checking whether that proposal is good enough, and you need to evaluate and evolve it. So I want to talk about the last 2 things. How do we check whether a proposal is good enough, and what do we do if it's not? So there's this idea, a mantra, good enough for now and safe enough to try, which means there are no objections. And basically what that means is you're focusing on decisions that are not perfect, because really there's no such a thing. And you don't get roadblocked by trying to do that. But also it means that you don't settle for mediocrity, because if you remember, objections are about arguments that reveal consequences or risks that you'd rather avoid, or worthwhile ways to improve things. And we see objections as gifts, because they are helping us to harness the distributed intelligence and the dissent and disagreement amongst the people, and we can avoid endless discussion because we're focusing on arguments that fall under those 2 categories, and we can focus on what's important. So I feel a bit like I've opened the Pandora box. There's so much to say about how we can harness objections and reach agreement in a group. And really, I think realistically, we need probably a few generations to to kind of reach that point where we're making decisions effectively. But I want to leave you with one story, which is from somebody. I heard it from somebody who joined one of our courses a few years ago, and then we met in a meetup, and they said that one of the most valuable things they took away from that course is that from that moment onwards, he didn't ask people, do you agree? Because that often invites people sharing their, well, let me think about it, how do I feel about it, what do I think? It's really inviting a different kind of conversation. They asked instead, do you have any objections? So, first of all, besides the fact that it helped them or it generated an opportunity to talk about objection and explain what that is, it also helped to focus the conversation on identifying potential problems and worthwhile improvements. So, an invitation for you, should you choose to accept it. Next time you want to reach an agreement, ask, do you have any objections, rather than, do you agree with me? So, evaluate and evolve agreements. This is, I would say, often overlooked. If we are going to make good enough and safe enough decisions, then we need to regularly reflect on how things are going and evolve them. And to do that, obviously, you need to have some kind of record of the things you agreed. So there is this simple template that you can use to record the essential elements of an agreement. The driver, who's responsible for what is it that you agreed, evaluation criteria, and, of course, a review date. So, getting towards the end, folks, these are the patterns that I mentioned so far. Some of them I got into more details, others just named. And there's many more. And there's one more I want to introduce you to, which is the idea of artful participation. Because I think reflecting on ourselves and our own behavior, like we heard yesterday, different people mentioned this, is really important for any organization or any collaboration to flourish. So it's a very simple idea. Artful participation is basically an invitation for each of you and each of us to ask ourselves this question. Is my behavior in this moment the greatest contribution I can make to the effectiveness of this collaboration? And if the answer is yes, then great, carry on. And if the answer is not sure, maybe not, then stop to reflect, what could you do differently? And it's really about bringing awareness to organizational drivers into the system if you see anything that is happening and needed. It's about raising possible objections, breaking sometimes agreement if they don't make sense, and helping to improve them. And holding back sometimes, making space for others. Or if it's somebody that usually holds back, maybe artful participation means stepping in more and taking more space. So, there's a lot I said, and many more patterns. You might ask yourself, how and where do I start? This seems like a lot. Well, I encourage you to start where you are and make sense of what you have and celebrate what is working. Don't change things unless there is a need. So identify and respond to prioritize and respond to organizational drivers, and pull in patterns that might help. And this is not just S3 patterns. Any patterns that you see out there in the world that you think this is what might help you to respond to that driver. And experiment, evaluate outcomes, learn, and improve. That's it, folks. Thank you so much. I'm done.
Thank you, Lili. This means we have plenty of time for questions, and we have a lot of questions. It's right behind us. I'll try to read them all up, and let's see how many we can answer. So the first one, I love it. We have a name again. That's cool. What could be a first thing to implement in a 50-people company for a tryout if you want to choose a potential low-risk, high-reward change, if there is any?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the low-risk, high-reward aspect is really important. I would say, based on what I just said now, there is no clear answer to that, so obviously it depends. The question would be, what is that you're doing that is not going so well and that you would like to improve? So that's the first place to start. Identify the drivers that are important for you as an organization to respond to, prioritize them, and then maybe look at that list and think about, okay, what would be something that would be a low risk if we're failing. I can give a story about this. There's a company who decided to try out consent decision-making for the first time to agree on a new salary system in a small company of 50 people without really understanding so much about what that actually means. They kind of read the guide, thought, oh yeah, that makes total sense, that's perfectly logic. And that turned out to be quite a negative experience. And that wasn't a low-risk situation, because obviously so many people are so invested in how their salary is. It was such a hot topic, and it wasn't a safe-to-fail experiment. So I don't think I can be more specific than this, but great question, and I'll let you figure out the answer for yourself.
Thank you. The next one, again, is an come on. They're doing this to me again. Often concerns are also about risks and consequences. How do you clarify the difference between concerns and objections?
Yes, so this is something I didn't mention. When we're making decisions in a group, we also have these hand signs that are useful. So if people have no objections, they do this. If they have any possible objections, they would use this. And this is to symbolize I have a gift to offer to everyone else. I see a reason why doing so would lead to consequences or risks we want to avoid, or worthwhile ways to improve things. So the other hand sign is this, which means I'm concerned. I cannot give an argument why doing this would lead to harm and so on, but I feel concerned. People feel concerned all the time. So concerns cannot be argued. They relate to possibilities, certain risks that might happen, but we are maybe potentially ready to take them. Because to be honest, we cannot always avoid harm, and we shouldn't. And we cannot always avoid risks, and we shouldn't. So in the first instance, it's the individual who makes the decision whether they have an objection or a concern. And then it's up to the group to qualify whether the argument that people bring as an objection is valid or not. So the thing is, you don't know for sure. It depends. Make a first guess. Put it out there. If you're unclear, then go for objection and check with your peers, because you're probably going to get some feedback and find out.
Thank you. The next one. The company I work at failed Agile, pretty short course to really hierarchical and bad culture. Would you recommend to try S3?
Okay. So failed Agile, I would wonder, okay, what does that mean? Failed to implement a certain framework, failed to bring about that spirit of iterative and incremental
Would the person
approach?
be happy to clarify, maybe?
Well, but I think I can just like focus on the second part. Would you recommend to try S3? I would recommend to anybody to try to solve the problems and opportunities they're facing as a priority. And whether S3 or not can help with that, it's up to you to decide. If you do want to build agile and resilient organization, that definitely I would recommend to check out the menu of patterns. So why Agile failed? Does the organization still want to head into that direction? Why do they want to do that? And if the answer is yes, we still want to go into that direction, then definitely warmly recommend it.
Thank you. Having read Frederick Laloux's book, I think the next question is interesting. How can we compare and choose between S3, Holacracy, and Teal, or other version of Sociocracy?
Yeah, I mean, I really get there's so many buzzwords out there, and people use terms without even really having a very deep understanding of which one they are. But first of all, Teal, I don't know, how do you do Teal? I think it's more of an idea, a concept, and there is this, I think, misinterpretation that Teal equals these methodologies and frameworks that you can apply. Holacracy is a methodology, so one difference is that there is not this idea of like pulling in patterns, but a clear set of rules that you kind of install into the organization. Everybody follows that, and that's how it works. It does work for some organizations, and some people say it's helpful to kind of get that like really radical change, that because it faces people to learn new habits and so on. But also many people report that it can be quite restrictive and sort of not fitting to their particular context. So what often happens is that after a few years of using Holacracy, some organizations decide they want to evolve it, or they want to kind of, they learn the rules and now they're ready to start experimenting, so they're looking to S3 to deal with that. And in terms of versions of Sociocracy, again, the same argument, methodology versus patterns-based approach, pulling in patterns to respond to organizational needs.
Thank you. How can you apply these in a for-profit, short-term focused, very typical large enterprise? How can you find sponsors? How can you deliver them timely results?
Good question. So, I think it's a good question, but also it's the wrong question, because it's not really about pitching S3. And if you go about doing that, then it's likely you're going to get some pushback. If you go with the intention of, hey, I see these awesome potential for improving how we work, or I see these challenges we're facing, and I think we should address them. And if you start a conversation there, and the people are on board with the drivers that need addressing, then you can present any pattern or any practice as a way of solving that problem. And you can design an experiment and try it out and see if it helps you to do that or not.
Thank you. Again, a named question. Many of these patterns, I guess, need a higher level of human consciousness. How do you manage, support, steward that aspect of the journey?
Yeah, I mean, I get it. It needs a high level of human consciousness. If you just need to follow a rule, you don't need to think about the rule on whether it's good or not. If you need to pull in stuff and you need to understand what these stuff is that you're pulling in. So it requires a higher level of investment in understanding your options. And it relies on, putting some intentionality, some consciousness in how you do that. So I would say the answer is invest in learning, do your best, get feedback, things like that.
Thank you. The next one is borderline sarcastic, at least to me. This framework seems to be for genuine people. How can it handle the others? Okay. Non-believers, sabotage, personal agenda. Mm-hmm.
Non-believers, yes. I like the non-believers. You know, I think it's really cool. We need to question if the things that were served on the plate is actually something that you should eat, right? So I think it's important to, like, I think this is a valuable perspective to have in any organization, the skepticals. Oh, I don't believe this is going to work. Great. If you can get those people on board, usually they turn into the biggest supporters. So, why they don't believe? What do they believe in? What is it that they care about? Okay, so why are they trying to sabotage things? What is their personal agenda, and does it fit with the overall objectives and the direction of the organization? And my experience so far is that if you go into that line of inquiry, you will find something of value in there, even if it might be just like 1%, you know, because people, you know, unless there is some mental illness there, or some like highly unresolved childhood issues, people do care, you know? They do care about the organization and about doing their job in a good way. You just need to tap into that.
Thank you. As an engineering manager, I find this question very amusing, the next one. Will there be an S4?
Yeah, that's a good question. The short answer is no, because the idea of constantly evolving and constantly improving is baked into S3, it's baked into the principles. So our work the last years has been to apply learning from our own experience, get feedback from a lot of other people who are using it, and evolve it. So in that sense, there's not going to be an S4. But if you think of, I would encourage anybody that sees an evolution that doesn't fit with the current way we define S3 to really come to us and tell us about it, because I would be really curious to know.
How S3 makes decisions more effective?
The thing is, S3 doesn't do anything. It's people who do things. Okay, so if you're hoping that you're going to use S3 and it's going to magically solve all your problems, then sorry to disappoint you. That's not going to happen. Yeah,
what kind of organization would benefit from S3 the most? Is there an organization for which you wouldn't recommend S3?
Mm-hmm. So, I think, well, it's kind of like the expected answer, but I'm sorry, I don't have a different one. So there are organizations that aspire towards and start up with this idea of being flat or horizontal and doing things differently. And they're going to be attracted to S3 because they're going to find resonance with some of the principles in there. And they're probably going to find value because there are these the aspects of bringing more clarity, structure that often is needed in these more adhocracy kind of environments. On the other hand, organizations that are rather hierarchical, command and control, and maybe not ready yet to kind of go full on experimenting with new ways of working, they are also going to recognize that there are some limitations to their approach and be open to consider new perspectives. So I think it's valuable for both sides of the spectrum and everything in between.
Thanks. And probably this is the last one, but let's see. Sometimes the question, do you have any objection, comes from a high-ranking officer that stops the discussion and closes it. What other sentences, what sentence to use? Okay.
What? S3 sentence?
Yeah.
Yes, so, okay. I think this question reveals an assumption we have about how decision-making is made, that there is a high-rank officer that stops the discussion. I mean, whether it's a high-rank officer or not, stopping useless discussions is a good thing, right? And if the underlying thing that is going on here is that people have power and they have influence. And we can be intimidated in the face of that if somebody says, okay, let's stop the discussion. Do you have any objections? We can feel overpowered by that. And if people understand what an objection is, and if they dare to show up and frame their thoughts and ideas and arguments in that particular way, we can only gain. So I don't really care whether it's an officer or a child that is asking me that question, because it's a good question. So I wouldn't throw away the question just because somebody who's in a high-rank position is asking it. But we do have this rather negative association with the word objection. Nobody wants to object. Oh, somebody objected on my proposal. You can take things quite personal. And yeah, if you find a different word that works better for you, or a different phrase that works better for you and achieves the same results, then go ahead and use it. I think it's more important about understanding what we mean by words and what we're trying to communicate, rather than finding the perfect word.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for coming and being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.